Closed doors, I'm a fool for your love.
The Neolithic is a long-term process which starts roughly around 10,000 years ago in different parts of the world, and where we sit here in Portugal, roughly around the end of the 6th millennium BC. What is the Neolithic? What was happening at that moment? We have to see it as a combination of mainly two processes. On one hand, and that's the first main driver, it's the process of adaptation. This process of adaptation relates to the effects of climate change, through which we all know the retreat of the very cold environment released the flourishing of the biome, vegetation, fauna, and obliged hunter-gatherers to adapt to different hunting techniques. This is the first approach with epipaleolithic and Mesolithic communities. But at a certain stage, some of these communities decided to enter a new way of life, which is characterized by a huge number of variables. And we could say that none of these variables is in itself fundamental. We have indicators of demographic growth, we have indicators of food production, animals domestication, we have changes in artifacts, for example, and we know there is a change in material culture, polished stone axes, for example, used to chop down trees, adzes to work on wood, the development of ceramics, of course, and all the kits that are related to a more domesticated, a more sedentary way of life. All these are characteristics alongside a different approach to decorative patterns, symbolics, beliefs. All these are part of the process, but I would say it is a mistake to consider that any of them is in itself fundamental. What is in the end fundamental? As I said first, the adaptation to environmental change. And we have to think because the reasons will vary according to the different places. What we know is that the very good conditions of the Holocene, with a warmer and humid climate, with a strong development of forests and bushes, allowed this more sedentary life and demographic growth, which in different places sometimes was interrupted by climatic oscillations. One of these oscillations is quite well known, around 8.2 thousand years ago, and this dry and cold episode eventually created an enormous stress to communities which were no longer as mobile as in the past, but for whom the resources available suddenly were reduced. And intensification mechanisms on one hand and interaction mechanisms on the other, meaning on one hand domestication of plants and of animals, and on the other the development of trading of raw materials and objects, became an important element for the survival of these communities. So in the end, if we wish, the Neolithic is a long process. It's a tentative process of adaptation which is combined with agency, choices, cultural options of different groups, which were not always the same, in a mosaic of different strategies of groups that we can, in prehistoric research, identify, and will tendentially converge to more complex societies and ultimately to the establishment of a certain rivalry of territories. We will see this later with the building of hill forts, and that's another story. That's already the story of the Bronze and Iron Ages. A key word in the Neolithic is transformation. We can understand transformation at different levels, but certainly a first very important dimension is landscape transformation. Certainly already in the Paleolithic we have several evidences of landscape transformation. For instance, the building of huts, which itself is an important feature in the landscape. But the Neolithic implies, among other things, clearing of spaces for agriculture and then building dwelling places, huts and other structures, also burial structures. And this, of course, has a strong implication. Round structures, as the one we see in these images, sometimes long houses, rectangular shaped long houses, which stands for the first human groups. In Iberia, both structures are present. The long houses are more rare, and we find them mostly in the coast. Further inland, the dominance is of round or oval-shaped structures. The transformation is not only the building of structures and the clearing of spaces, it's also the transformation of raw materials. Keeping on a tradition that runs from the early humans over 2 million years ago, we see a diversity of processes which are no longer limited to physical, mechanical transformation of lithic or wooden organic materials as in the Paleolithic, but also we see the dawn of chemistry, if you like. We see the transformation of raw materials, of clay, mixed with different ingredients to produce pottery. And this is a major breakthrough in terms of a cognitive understanding of the possibilities of manipulating raw materials. We will see then, after this first major invention, which in the end actually was already present in the Paleolithic, but very rarely for only symbolic objects, this becomes a regular element, a regular component of daily life. Pottery will be very soon, after 3,000 years, continued with metals, as we know, and opening an acceleration, a growing acceleration of raw materials transformation. The Neolithic is a process of certainly intensification, domestication, but as I mentioned before, it's more than that, a process of landscape transformation and a process of interaction. And this brings us to the question, how these ideas, this knowledge spread across all over the world, in the case of Europe, throughout the Mediterranean. Now, this is when the contextual analysis is very important. We know that there is one main axis of dissemination of these ideas, of this knowledge, eventually also of people, across the shores of the Mediterranean, up to the shores of the Atlantic through the Iberian Peninsula. This phenomena we observe in many places, including here in Portugal, in the area of Tomar, for example, and in the coast. But we have also evidence of different processes of interaction, of mobility. For example, here we are seeing the Tagus Valley, the Tagus Basin, which has an access to your right to the Spanish Meseta, to the center of the Iberian Peninsula. And the Tagus has a vicinity with a system of drainage basins, which are the Guadiana and the Guadalquivir valleys in Portugal and Spain, which carry themselves the spread of other groups. Whereas the first coastal dispersal, for example, in their process of local adaptations, used the caves for dwelling and particularly for burying, the human groups that brought domestication and herding to this region used two main other drivers, tools of landscape transformation. One was rock art, and the other one, we will see an example, was megalithism. As a result of adaptations to the environmental changes, new economic strategies, since the Mesolithic, a new feature starts to emerge. That's the mound, and the first expression we have of it are the shalmidons, the Mesolithic shalmidons, which are known in different river basins throughout the Mediterranean. But then, at a certain stage, other features occur. Apart from rock art, also the building of standing stones like this one, which initially are isolated many years, sometimes erected, having on their base grinding stones, small mills, probably as a witness of cereals processing, but still in a pre-agricultural stage. Then we observe in certain parts of Europe, and certainly here in the Tagus Basin, the development of a new type of feature. That's the passage grave, and this is where I'm standing now. It's, in this case, a chamber built around 4000 BC, so roughly 6,000 years ago. And in this case, we have a round chamber, which then leads to what characterizes in our region as a lower corridor that gives the access to the chamber. This is a burial structure, and it's a complex burial structure. We see orthostats of different shapes. They have been damaged through time, so we are not seeing exactly their original shape, but in any case they were roughly like we can see. Eventually this was not covered. We don't know. Some of these monuments were covered with a big stone, others were not, and in the excavations of these and other monuments in this region, we didn't find evidence of capstones and coverage of the roofs, which was probably made with wood or eventually even left open to the sky. But we see more than that. We see a pavement, a complex pavement built on stones, of course, and a stone-built mound. In some parts of Europe, we will see mounds made primarily in stone. We call them cairns. And even in this region, sometimes we see features around like small standing stones all around the monument that we call the curb. This monument doesn't have a curb, but you will see it in other videos we will present with my colleagues. But in this case, we can clearly see that an earthen mound, which was made with the soil around, was then covered with stones, giving the image of being built like the cairns that we know in other parts of Europe, sometimes with a huge dimension like the monuments of Antequera in Spain or the Boyne Valley in Ireland. So megalithism stands as one of the features that we have to keep as a main reference in this process of landscape transformation. I hope you will be able to come over and participate with us in the study of some of these monuments. Either the monuments are built on stone or cave dwellings and settlements as well.